Welcome, everyone, to our CHBA webinar series public review for the 2025 National Construction Codes. I'm Frank Lohmann, CHBA's Director of Building Science, and I'm joined today by Alex Bowles, CHBA's Senior Technical Advisor, Climate Codes and Regulation, and two surprise guests today. Alexandre Bigonès is a Technical Advisor at the Office of Energy Efficiency in NRCan's Home and Communities Division, and Brad Cass is CHBA's Technical Manager, Net Zero Housing. And we're supported today by Natasha Rombo and Chloe Perrault from the marketing and communications team at CHBA. Before we dazzle you with all the code changes and commentary, here's some housekeeping. We've muted all participants so that there are no distractions. We will, however, try to make the webinar a bit interactive. Firstly, you can ask questions throughout by writing them in the question and answer panel, which you can access by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window. Or at the top, I don't know where it is for you. We may answer some of your questions live during the webinar or at the end or directly in the Q&A panel during the webinar. And today is a little different than other webinars. We will stop for questions and answers after each topic. Actually, if you want anyone specific to answer your question, also let us know that by putting the name in your question and then we know. Secondly, in terms of making it a bit more interactive, we will have a few polls for you. And when we launch a polling question, you'll see a response function pop up. Natasha, let's maybe try out our first poll right now with the question on the primary region where you and your business or organization operate. So you'll see those choices. Today we have provinces, not regions. Great. Okay. So whatever is closest, I hope we have. Yeah, we have the territories. Oh, we have them all. Thank you. The last couple of times we had regions, so that's why I had to give this speech, but I see that the polling has changed. So that should be easy to fill out. And Natasha, once you see that it's reaching the point of people having, oh, perfect. So there's our representative our guests today in terms of the locality that they're representing or that they're coming from. BC and Alberta are very strong, 20-25%, in Ontario 37%, the strongest. But I'd like to see that the smaller provinces are also here: Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Atlantic Canada, and even Quebec. That's fantastic. Thank you, Natasha. Also, please be aware that the webinar is being recorded. And the recording will be available on the CHBA website in case you can't stay to the end or you want to listen to a certain portion again. I should clarify that it is available to CHBA members on our website and that you have to be logged in to access the recording. We will also post a PDF document of the slide deck on the same website. I'm pointing this out now because we will go through some slides fairly quickly. And I said this in the last webinars as well. Today it'll be very quickly. So PDF may be coming. May be helpful. Even though you are probably all experienced in Zoom or Teams or WebEx, just to remind you that you can manage your own view of the webinar and make the PowerPoint bigger or smaller by sliding the dividing bar. This is the last webinar episode of our mini-series, which consisted of 3 webinars over 3 weeks. The purpose of the entire series is to alert all of you about the code changes that are out for public review right now and what is still coming in the next public review. We're hoping that these presentations will become a guide for you to review the changes and for developing comments. We also hope that all interest groups and profession find this equally helpful. On that note, actually, let's try the other poll right now to find out who is represented today in today's audience as to which professional group you're belonging to. And the list is limited, so we're hoping that you can find something that relates to you or is close enough. That's a Zoom feature that only allows us to have 10 choices. So we'll see what we're going to get today. And we didn't even give you an other, so there's really no other way. We'll see probably fewer responses that way if you're not one of those that we see there today. By the time it takes for those polls, we probably have a lot of people here, I see. Okay, so site builder, modular builders, 36% largest group, a few renovators and developers as well. Good to see, almost 10% each. Architects and engineers, 22%. That's good to see, really, because these topics address everyone. Code officials, always happy to see code officials here too. Planning, And lenders, insurance, warranty providers, great, and some HPA stuff. Excellent representation. Thank you, everyone. Before we get started, there's one other thing. We have 90 minutes today for the webinar, and it will include some commentary, discussion, and hopefully answering more of your questions. Because we're stopping in between for some commentary and questions, we will for sure go over an hour, but we may also be finished earlier. So I'll just say, really, we have a bit of a soft ending today, somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes. Today's webinar is called The Deep Dive. We will look at the code changes for 5 subjects and have a brief discussion about the background and maybe about what implications might be there from a net zero perspective. And then, as I already said, after each subject, we will try and answer a few questions. And since today's webinar is called The Deep Dive, I thought I'd introduce you our diving guides and theme. All the way on the right is Alexandre Bigonès. Alexandre was involved in many of the committees that worked on these code changes. In many ways, Alexander has an interest in making sure these code changes are easily understood and simple to implement. He will provide us with some background and maybe some nuances and some of the changes today, and will present a few slides about the heat pump related changes at the end. Our next deep diving guide is Brett Cass, as CHPA's technical manager of the Net Zero Housing Program. Brett can give us some insights how these code changes would impact CHPA's Net Zero labeling program, or maybe what their experiences are. And maybe he can talk about some of the trends he sees where net zero builders have already found cost-effective solutions. If you tuned in for our 2 last webinars, you already know Alex Bowles and myself. Alex will keep us on time today and will provide, I will provide the codes update, and then Alex will manage the Q&As. So before we look at the actual code text, I'll explain to you where we are in the code process, as we have done on the previous 2 webinars. And then I will highlight code changes for the 5 subjects you see here in bold. And Alexandre and Brett will provide some comments and background, and we will be answering your questions. As I've done in other webinars, I will point out on each slide which changes go to the 2023 fall public review reviews and which ones go to the 2024 winter public review. Because the fall public review is already going on, I will also include a few hints on how to submit effective comments for public review. And at the end, we might open up for some more discussion and for your questions again. A little side note here, when we were preparing for today, we realized that we will need several more single subject focused webinars in February and March. And when the 2024 winter public review, this is when it actually takes place. So notice on the right, these are the subjects that we are currently thinking we would do in 2024. There are some significant changes coming for air tightness and new energy use metrics, hopefully simpler for modeling. We want to talk about those in detail with guest presenters, and we would like to provide more information on the 2 prescriptive methods, yet more, because we're going to talk about it today. We're thinking that we would actually do a hands-on webinar by going through some examples together. So here is the code process and a schedule for the next 3 public reviews. As far as we know, these are the last 3 public reviews and before the publication of the 2025 codes. First one started October 23rd and will run until December 18th. So that is when all our comments and your comments, if you want to submit some, have to be submitted. The next public review is then scheduled to run from February to April in 2024. And then there's one more public review for the fall 2024 that is reserved for the updating of all reference documents and standards. After that is code publication, which according to NRC is still planned for December 25. And then no more than 18 months after that is when we would expect the provinces and territories to adopt those codes. So here's our first subject. It's the prescriptive trade-off path. And on the left side, you see the proposed changes that belong to the subject. Those with hyperlinks are available for comment now. Before we flip through each of these, I'll give you a quick rundown of how this method works. At the top right, you see that each tier has a minimum number of points that have to be accumulated by home design features in order to reach that tier. The things you can get points for are called energy conservation measures, or ECM. Some examples are on the list to the left on your screen there, and you'll see some of it in tabular format on the illustration there to the right. And we'll go through those in detail, so don't worry about it, not seeing much detail there. The ECM points vary by climate zone and, of course, by the efficiency of the measure. At the end, the sum of all your points has to meet or exceed, of course, the minimum targets. Yes, I said targets, plural. Tiers 3 to 5 have a minimum building envelope target. So for these tiers, you will have to show that the energy conservation measures gather enough points for 2 separate targets, the building envelope target and the total target. And don't worry, we'll get through each of these in detail now. First, here's a quick refresher on how this method works in terms of an example. The target points for tier 2, which is already in the code, is 10, but you also need to comply with tier 1 as a prerequisite, which means an HRV or ERV is installed and all the prescriptive requirements in 936.2 to 936.4 are met. This is an example we actually presented in 2022 as a part of a webinar as well. For this example, we assumed a 2,000 square foot single family detached home in Edmonton, which is in climate zone 7B. We'll assume an air tightness test result of 2 air changes per hour. So yes, this home will be tested. A heat recovery system with a sensible heat recovery efficiency rating of at least 60% and a hot water tank with an energy factor of 0.8. This gets you exactly 10 points. In the 2020 NBC, the minimum points available in this climate zone start quite high for above ground walls and air tightness, and the maximum points for all the other categories may not total to more than 10 points, meaning that you might not be able to reach tier 2 in this climate zone without either improving the above ground wall or the air tightness. Now, this may change in the 2025 code when there are a lot more ECM points, energy conservation measures, available, and we'll see a few of them in a few minutes. For reference, when we presented this last year in climate zone B, an air tightness of 1.5 air changes would achieve 12.1 points. And similarly, an above ground wall effective R value of R25 would achieve 9.3 points, just so you have some reference. Each of these would meet tier 2 without any other measures beyond the basic 60% heat recovery unit, which is already the prerequisite. We will get back to that 6.1 points for air tightness in a few slides. So let's start with water heating equipment and look at some points in detail. Here are the points that already exist for a number of water heater types. Our Edmonton example here, a house had a gas-fired storage type heater and got 3.1 points for that. One thing to note here is that electric water heaters do not get any points. Electric, that is, electric water heaters. Apparently, because in the modeling they are the reference benchmark, but nonetheless, we think they should be listed here as an acceptable solution. We might put a comment to that effect because we think it's otherwise confusing that they're not acceptable. Another point here is that heat pump water heaters are not getting substantially more points. This may be surprising, and it is due to the fact that when the modeling was done for these points, the reference house also got a heat pump water heater. So there were very few points here to be gained. This is not the case under the inner guide, I'm told. The committees agreed to look into it, but the work has been deferred to the next code cycle. So this will be one comment that we're making, although it may be discarded as it is not related to any actual proposed change, but actually to the existing code. Yes, and I will leave the targets pinned to the top here for your reference. And you have probably noticed the QR code on the bottom left. If you scan it, you can read along on the actual proposed change form online for those that are out right now. Here are the points for drain water heat recovery. They are proposed to be added. A few other requirements are proposed in addition to the points here. In other words, you have to do a few things before you get these points. You have to follow the manufacturer's instructions. And if 1 or 2 showers are in above ground stories, you have to provide all, which means all 1 or all 2 of them, with a drain water heat recovery. Or where there are more than 2 showers above ground, at least 2 of those showers have to be equipped with drain water heat recovery in order to get these points. So if this is a feature in your homes, these points would go towards your total target points. Let's continue with HVAC equipment. As you recall from the Edmonton example, the points for the HRVs are already in the code. However, considering that the sensible recovery efficiency of 60% is the prescriptive minimum for HRVs and ERVs, the points on the top row of this table are kind of free points because that's your minimum anyway. But that's where the Edmonton example came from, as you see the 0.8. What's proposed for gas-fired furnaces here, although you can see these points don't amount to much, but I've not seen any points for electric resistance boilers or furnaces here either, maybe for the same reason as for the water heaters. So that's something to be clarified. Maybe Alexander can comment on that later. So this is for gas-fired furnaces, the points for these 2 efficiencies, depending on climate zone. Here are the points for oil-fired furnaces. They're also proposed. It's on a different proposed change form than the previous ones, and it's not going to the 2023 fall public review. This one might get hotly debated, especially, we know that especially in rural and northern and remote areas, oil is still being used, often the only available fuel. Eventually, the committee approved this proposed change form with points in all climate zones for these 2 efficiencies. We also know there are better efficiencies available for oil-fired furnaces, and we would likely suggest amending this table by way of our comments. It will also be interesting to review this change in light of the introduction of the greenhouse gas emissions. We'll get to that towards the end of our presentation, which may look like it eliminates the possibility of installing oil-fired furnaces, except that in some areas, as I said, oil is still often the only available heating choice. But we'll talk about this when we get to the greenhouse gas emissions, or after this section. Of course, points for air source heat pumps for space heating are also proposed. I'm showing this here a bit as a teaser. We will talk about these proposed change form later in a bit more detail. But just to have a look at the order of magnitude of the points you get here for the heat pumps, it is also proposed that you can look up the values, or so there's 2 ways. On the left side, you see a lookup table. On the right side, you see a calculation. And there's another set of tables, duplicates of these for other purposes. Alex will explain this to us. Not Alex, Alexandre Begonès will explain all of this to us towards the end of today's webinar. So back to air tightness. You remember the example, and I made it easy for you to find it here. It's highlighted in yellow. This is worth paying attention to, since the energy conservation point values in the code that is going to be adopted in your region probably soon, if it hasn't already, may change again when the 2025 codes come around. So there are 2 corrections made in this proposed change to this table on air tightness. Number 1, the values for attached homes below were moved up 1 category because that was truly an error in publishing, which means that 2.5 air changes per hour would give you points in attached housing. And the other correction, maybe more significant, NRC found an issue with how the points were modeled for the last code and corrected them. Up here, maybe I have a, there you go, okay. So for our Edmonton example, this means you would need a 1.79 air changes per hour test results to get those points now under the new 2025 code, where under the current code, an ACH of 2.0 was good enough to get the points. As you can see, the same is generally true for all energy conservation points values in climate zones 5, 6, 7, or 8 for single-family homes, except for zone 6, which remains almost unchanged. For attached homes, it's the bottom table. The impact is that you get more points for the same air tightness value compared to what's in the code today. Another important proposed change deals with interpolation of ECM points. This is a great addition. PCF 1834 simply adds a footnote to all the point tables for all kinds of things to say that you can use linear interpolation. It says that you can interpolate between measure efficiency and points. This applies to all tables, not just air tightness. That is how I calculated the 1.7 air changes per hour to get my 6.1 points. that I needed to meet tier 2 in Edmonton. There are two methods generally. A graphic method on the left, you would draw two axes, one for points and one for ACH, and then connect the two data points that you know from the table. And then you know that you need 6.1. So you find that on your axis and you go up to the data line and you see what kind of ACH value corresponds to it. Or you use the calculation method on the right. I have started that with the formula at the top and filled out for this example and did the calculation. So you'll have that in your PDF. It'll become in handy, and it gives a lot of flexibility if you're between points. That brings us to windows and doors. Here we already have some point values, and there are some that are proposed to be added. One thing I noticed on this change is that the costing is based on 2019 costing data that was updated to include inflation. However, we've done a review and found that the industrial product price index, at least for construction-related products, may have gone up 45% since 2019, and that labor cost is also up by between 25 and 28%. So if you review this change, make sure you review the impact analysis section and let us know whether the costing data needs updating here. We would make that part of our comment as well. Here's PCF 1923, also called Building Envelope Central, and this change is going to the 2024 winter. I called it Building Envelope Central. It's not called that. The change is going to the 2024 winter public review. This table for walls is already in the code. I will flip through the next 7 or 8 slides very fast. They all cover the tables that this proposed change contains, so all in form. I just want you to see what is proposed so you can check it out, what categories of ECMs are available, and then you do your own calculations about them. So here are the proposed points for ceilings below attics. As you can see, not that many points, even at R80. That gets you only between 1 and 3 points, depending on the climate zone. Here are the proposed points for cathedral ceilings and flat roofs. A very similar story to attics. Again, even a fewer points because the R value is not as high. Here are the proposed points for assemblies that combine ceilings below attics and cathedral ceilings and flat roofs. I just learned, and maybe I'll explain it here, is that this is for roof types that have both the ceiling, the attic ceiling and the cathedral ceiling. Maybe Alexandra can explain this a little bit more at the end. Here are the proposed points for exposed floors. An exposed floor over unheated space has to be 30 square meters or 300 square feet before this table is applicable, so that the points cannot be collected for, say, a few square feet of cantilevered flooring over a porch. You can sense some of the limitations of this method, of this entire method, by looking at this, or rather some of the difficulties of setting up the point system without knowing the actual areas of walls, floors, and attics. Here are the points for building assemblies below grade or in contact with the ground that are already in the code. Is it updated? No. There you go. Okay. And for the last table for this proposed change, this is the one for slabs on grade. All these points are proposed. These points were not necessary for tiers 1 and 2, but when the committee realized that tier 5 was, I don't want to say pretty unreachable, but pretty difficult to reach, especially in colder climate zones, they added all these points tables. And keep in mind, this is so it's for tier 5 as well, tier 4, tier 3, and for other tiers now. Yeah. So with that, we're coming to our first question period. We would have about 5 minutes. Alex, Alexandra, Brett. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, a lot of great feedback and good questions coming in. So let's just jump right into it. Several questions coming in from air source heat pumps as well as the DWHRs. So I'll start with one here. Is an air source heat pump supposed to be the principal heating device to get the points, or can it be dual fuel hybrid?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can take that one on if you don't mind. And so, as Frank presented, there were really two approaches under this prescriptive points-based approach. You could either use a table that fixed one key variable, which is basically how much of your peak heating demand is being met by the heat pump. And so there's one table that is fixing that at 60%, and then you're able to look up exactly how many points you would get for that type of installation, which implies that 40% of that peak heating load is being met by some supplementary system. I'm going to be talking in more detail about that specifically later on in this webinar.
That's a great question. Great response, Alex. Another question regarding air source heat pumps. So perhaps you'd want to take this one as well. For the air source heat pump requirement, does it specify if they need to be cold climate?
Very good question. And so under the Tier 5 prescriptive package that Frank will be covering next, there is a requirement for it to be cold climate. However, some of you who are following all of the evolution in the regulatory space around air source heat pump understand that the metrics are changing. There's regulations being introduced continuously. Even in 2025, there'll be new requirements, mostly on the energy efficiency regs. But I'm going to be touching upon how the energy efficiency regs play with the prescriptive requirements of the code.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to jump to drain water heat recovery unit questions. So can you double the points if you have 2 drain water heat recovery units with 4 showers?
Good question. Unfortunately not. And that's part of the limitations of this compliance path is we had to assume that it's prescriptive in nature. And so we had to make a certain amount of assumptions in developing these points. And that's why we have, for drain water heat recovery, we have additional requirements as outlined by Frank with respect to if you've got 2 above grade showers and both of them or all of them need to be hooked up. And that has to do with the assumption around how much hot water you're using and how that's incorporated into the modeling that eventually informs how many points you're getting for these measures. And so long-winded way of saying no.
Yeah, no, that's great, Alex. Another one for DWHRs. Can one unit essentially service multiple bathrooms?
It's important to keep in mind that this is for showers exclusively. And so if one unit could service multiple showers, that's a really good question. I
wonder if so there was a sentence in there that you have to follow manufacturer's instructions. And I wonder if that's what this is for. I don't think it's clear in the requirements whether it has to be 1 unit or 2. It just has to serve 2 showers if you have 2, right?
Correct. And so I haven't thought about this too much, but I would assume, and maybe a point of clarification, if both of those showers are connected to the same drain water heat recovery system, I would imagine that would be appropriate.
And so whoever was the questioner here, this is exactly the exercise we'd like to do, right? Is we'd like to see, is what's being proposed clear? So the proposed change should be read by someone who does that and say, is my solution an acceptable solution, or do I need to clarify that wording? And then either put in a comment like that, saying, here's why this doesn't work for me, change this word to that and I'll be fine, or send it to us and we'll include it. So those are exactly the reasons why we have these webinars. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Would electric water heaters be included if a thermo drain is attached to it?
You may have noticed that electric storage tanks are not eligible for points under this compliance path. And so the short answer is no. We're not prohibiting you from installing it. However, you can't claim points for the system.
It's very clear. I guess this is more of a comment. BC Hydro would be supportive of recognizing electric water heaters as an acceptable solution.
I certainly don't disagree. I think part of the issue here is that, and this was the methodology that was used for better or worse, is that we're measuring a relative improvement, right? We're not measuring absolute efficiency. And so there was an understanding that the base code electric storage tank has a standby loss prescribed by the code. And the understanding was that there's not a whole lot of room for improvement above and beyond that storage tank. And so we would be looking at very, very few points, probably fractions of points, just as a result of the methodology. And so the decision was actually taken last code cycle to not look at that as an eligible measure.
Yeah, that's great, Alex. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, there may be a discussion later on when we talk about the greenhouse gas emissions, or in quotation marks, electrification kind of change, to see how that would impact. And certainly each jurisdiction, like in this case it was BC, may then have a way to emphasize certain requirements and or others, right?
That's great. I do have a comment on the chat. Yes, drain water can serve multiple showers per manufacturer. So I think that is a good answer. I believe we do have to move on, Frank. There are multiple questions that we can get at a later date. What do you think, Frank?
Thanks. Yeah, I maybe later on I would like to hear from Brett as well, if there are any things that he saw in the prescriptive trade-off method. Maybe we can combine that with the next package as to what he sees from the Net Zero Home program, so that we get a flavor of where these prescriptive methods stand in terms of net zero. But I'll continue, and then we'll maybe ask that. So another new prescriptive compliance option is available for Tier 5 only. And while we refer to the first method as the points method, we refer to this one as a package method. It's very much like an Energy Star Builder compliance option or package. The only approved proposed change we have seen was for Tier 5, but we're hearing that some work may be underway to create packages for Tiers 2, 3, and 4 as well. Maybe even for the next code, we are not sure yet. One contentious point may be that the prerequisites are for airtightness, since the package would have to assume a certain airtightness to be deemed to comply with the equivalent target on the performance side. So it's not as flexible as the points, where you can just look up what you have. Here, in order to provide a package, the airtightness would have to be known. Back to this proposed change, though, the prerequisites for Tier 5 package are strict airtightness levels, HRV or ERV with 75%, heat pump for both space conditioning and water heating, and at least one drain water heat recovery unit. After the prerequisites that apply to all packages, the code will present a few options based on climate zones. We'll look at those in a moment. One other comment here I wanted to make is that the costing shows an incremental cost of $30,000 to $40,000 relative to Tier 1. The impact analysis done for this does not state whether the costing data is from 2023 or has been adjusted. An earlier version stated that of this form, of this proposed change, stated that the costing data would be from 2020, which would mean we would add about 30 to 40%, as I just explained, since the industrial product price index has gone up that much since before the pandemic. And the same is true for labor rates in that time frame. So we will see whether NRC updates the cost information on this proposed change before the winter 2024 public review, before we see it. And if not, we would likely submit a respective comment on that, and maybe even a statement as to what the status at the time of the costing data is would be helpful. Okay, just checking here. Yeah, here we see two package tables that use fully electric equipment. You can see the building envelope design elements in the top portion of the tables, depending on the climate zone, and the space heating and water heating equipment requirements, again, by climate zone at the bottom. The left table applies to all homes, and the right table applies to those homes for which the conditioned volume is smaller than 300 cubic meters. I think we said this earlier, or maybe not, was it a different presentation? That usually translates to about a 1,300 square foot single story building. I've highlighted the wall RSI value here just to show the small home volume relaxation. Some values stay the same and some are relaxed. And if you've seen our first webinar, we have corrected that because we provided some misinformation there. So the way I presented this today is correct. Only the volume makes a difference in which package applies, not anything else. Sometimes my slide's not updating here. Okay. So here we see two package tables that use dual energy options. The dual energy here means that the primary heating and water heating is still electric, but your supplementary heating can be gas or oil based, assumingly, if you choose. So the building envelope design elements in these tables and the electric tables are the exact same. And the left table here also applies to all homes, while the right table applies to homes with small volumes, small conditioned volumes. It seems to me these 4 tables could easily be reduced to 2, since the electric heat pump water heater is included here too. So just giving all options, it should be much simpler to present that. So that was it on the prescriptive package, tier 5 only, as I said, and the prescriptive points. Maybe before we go to questions, Alex, maybe we can go to Brett and see how the 2 methods, it's because we really haven't had any prescriptive methods that go close to the net zero territory, how that relates potentially to net zero, and from Brett's experience.
Yeah, sure. I can speak to the tier 5 packages actually that we just saw on that last slide, if you want as well too. If you want to go back a couple slides there, some of those prerequisite requirements that we saw would be pretty common with kind of the average CHBA net zero ready house. That 1.0 ACH is pretty common. Our minimum requirement is 1.5 air changes per hour, but most builders are going quite a bit lower to 1 or even less. So that's pretty common. HRV or ERV, that's standard, and then the heat pump water heater, drain water heat recovery, those would be common too in homes that select to do so. Where the homes probably differ a little bit is on the next slide. Maybe those R values of the wall assemblies and the envelope assemblies are a little bit higher than what we might typically see. But keep in mind that our builders are able to really optimize and find the low-hanging fruit on their envelope assemblies. So just for an example, on the wall assemblies, maybe in like a zone 6 home, we, instead of a 5.69 wall, maybe on average we would see closer to an effective 5 or even a little bit below 5. So and then that's probably like an R28, an R30 or so to convert to R value. So that's to give a little bit of a context on kind of the average CHBA net zero home. Obviously, very few homes build the exact average home. There's a whole variety. But just a bit of context from the voluntary side of things.
Thanks, Brett. That's great. Alex, now you can see if we have questions maybe.
Yeah, a lot of great questions are coming in, so I'll start with this one. Do any of the building envelope tables allow interpolation based on assembly RSI, or only the air tightness tables? I guess what they're asking is, can you interpolate? Go ahead.
I don't know if Alexander wants to answer. Maybe I don't think you can, because this is a package. It's a package, take it or leave it. Is that correct, Alexander?
That's correct. And so I just want to clarify that this is a separate compliance path, although it is prescriptive. This one does not allow interpolation. It's inflexible by nature. This is what you shall do. And the points-based approach does allow for interpolation and allows you to mix and match the measures depending on your supply chain and whatnot.
Essentially, this is a copy of the prescriptive path 936.2-4 in one table. That's really for tier 5. So that's really what this is with the prerequisites, and this is essentially a copy of all the tables. So there's no interpolation.
Yeah, that's great. This is a long-winded question, but I think it's important. How can provinces be more involved in the process of creating these packages for other tiers so that the outcomes are realistic, both in terms of measures and cost data? It is currently unclear as observers how we're able to get involved in discussions and analysis.
Alexander, you want to take that? Or, is it province and territories? Is it government? Do you think you get the sense from the question that it's governments, or is it province and territorial observers from the industry? Because there's potentially 2 different answers here, but it's not clear. So maybe I'll give the one for the industry. If anyone is out there, a builder, renovator, developer, modular builder, and you think you need to get involved, give Alex or myself a call, and we will make sure that you find out where the discussions take place, so that your perspective from your region or your locality or your province is reflected. And that's incredibly important. We do our best, but sometimes we miss things. So that's my answer for the industry, for the observers. In terms of provinces, how can provinces get involved? Maybe Alexander, do you know more about the other tiers and what's going on tiers 2, 3, or 4?
In terms of the development of those other tiers, there is a task group working on that, and so happy to share a link to basically the schedule as to when those task groups are meeting so that you can join the discussion. I know that under the new governance framework of the code's development process, the intent is to put the provinces and territories in the driver's seat and have them provide the policy guidance. However, I do recognize that that's pretty high level, and they generally don't tend to get involved in the nitty gritty. And so I would just echo what Frank is saying, that we would encourage you to engage at the task group level.
Yeah, but ultimately, CHBA is in favor of that too. So if we can push the tiers 3, 4 with packages like this, we would like to see this. And so I will try to find out what the timelines are for that. I think, Alex, am I correct? We need to move on. Is that...
You know the look on my face that yes, definitely. But there's more questions and we could certainly
so Mark, if you have some good ones, mark them for the end. We'll take care of them at the end. Thank you. This one is a quick one, just one slide. This change is available at public review for comments right now. It was developed by a committee that looked at the potential consequences of high-performance homes. In other words, this change was developed to avoid unintended consequences of highly energy-efficient homes, namely the risk of overheating. This risk had been identified by many energy committees since 2010, and CHBA had written to the codes bodies in 2020 to fix this before the 2020 codes were published, but to no avail. And this is not the risk of overheating from extreme climate events. It's just talking about the risk of overheating from the point of energy efficient design. So on the prescriptive side, it is proposed to introduce a maximum solar heat gain coefficient for windows and glazed doors based on how many windows and doors that home has. A requirement was actually in the original National Energy Code for houses in 1997 already, but that one was never added to the fenestration requirements in section 936. You can see in this table here, for a given fenestration and door to wall ratio, or FDWR, you'd have to select fenestration products that fall below a maximum solar heat gain coefficient. While we think this is a step in the right direction, it is still not clear to us why the prescriptive path does not consider the orientation of the windows or the climate zone of the home, and why air conditioning is only recognized as an effective mitigation to overheating in the performance path, but not in the prescriptive path, which is the top of the page here. When we met with the fenestration industry, they also noted that the solar heat gain coefficient of 0.26 is very stringent, and that exterior shading could also be a prescriptive solution. So we will raise all these points in our comments. At the bottom here, in the performance path, this change fixes a few things that CHBA had raised at the time when we wrote our letter. It recognizes air conditioning as a solution, and where no air condition is provided, allows now a 10% tolerance between reference and proposed house when modeling the peak cooling load. It also exempts homes with a very small design cooling intensity, or small cooling load in this case. It is not explained how to calculate the design cooling intensity, so we will put in a comment to that effect, should be clarified. And as I said earlier, it's important to note that this is not a requirement to mandate cooling systems, and it does not guarantee a house will never overheat, because a reference house complying with subsection 926.5 in the performance path could still be prone to overheating in some circumstances. So it's about minimizing the risk of overheating in very energy efficient buildings by virtue of what the code requires those buildings to do. CHBA knows that overheating of highly efficient homes is a risk, and we would actually suggest that province and territories consider including these requirements in the current codes they're about to adopt, or that builders voluntarily apply these requirements ahead of the 2025 codes to make sure energy efficient design does not contribute further to the risk of overheating. Although it's kind of difficult, saying air conditioning shall be recognized is difficult to say, well, I'm doing it, could you please recognize it? If the code doesn't say that, there's not much builders can do. And I think that was it for this slide. It's a simple topic, one slide. And do we have any questions, Alex?
That's great, Frank. I guess if we do have a moment to kind of backpedal and go back to some of the original questions, would that be appropriate?
Sure. Or if we have comments from Alexander or Brett, that would be fine too. Either way.
Gentlemen, what would you prefer? Is it okay if I ask a few questions?
Yep, go ahead.
Excellent. For tier 5, what do you do if you don't have an electric grid power or you are on a diesel electric grid?
That's a very good question. What
So
do you do?
So for tier 5, yeah. So I think that was pretty much discussed in the committee that you cannot reach tier 5 in those, and in many other northern areas, it becomes already sufficiently difficult. I don't know if Brett has any experience in net zero. How far is his furthest north net zero, and what kind of performance and what kind of fuel is there? We will talk a little bit about that on the GHG side because that also came up. But in terms of tier 5, yeah, in some areas it will simply not be possible.
Yeah, in our program, we haven't had homes exceed climate zone 7B yet, so nothing to the extreme far north yet.
I have a comment on that. I mean, the task groups have been pretty diligent in trying to demonstrate that these compliant solutions are appropriate for all climate zones. And so, for example, under the points-based approach, Adam Wills, shout out to Adam Wills, he did a lot of the heavy lifting here, demonstrated that in order to comply with the points-based approach for tier 5 in climate zone 8, you would need to draw the most efficient measure of all eligible measures, including the small house credit. And so this was basically a demonstration that it was possible, highly difficult, and you would need to pull out all the stops, so to speak. And so when we're talking about tier 5 on the energy side, we're not too concerned where that energy is coming from. And so if it's diesel generated electricity, presumably you can still hit a certain level of efficiency for the home because we're not talking about the source of that energy just yet.
I think that's a great clarification, Alex. Thanks for jumping in on that. If natural gas is available for furnaces in 7A and 7B, but no electricity, why are the points less than oil? And these were the trade-off points for, yeah, you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I just want to reiterate that the points reflect the relative improvement over the code minimum. And so the code minimum for a furnace is 95% AFUE. And so I think we're giving points for 97, which is a 2% improvement. Whereas on the oil furnace side, the code minimum is 85 AFUE, 85% AFUE. And so there's much more room for improvement, so to speak, on that relative improvement scale. And that's why the points are greater for oil-fired furnaces.
That's a great answer. And just as kind of going to expand on that, why more efficient oil furnaces don't get any points in zones 4, 5, and 6?
Really good question. I was in a hard spot working on this task group. I have to declare my conflict of interest being an employee of Enercan, and in trying to effectively recognize the efficiency of oil furnaces. I do understand that they're still commonly used in remote regions and whatnot. And I've been told by builders who use this in their practice, and they get all the way up to condensing levels. And so at the in-person ski meeting, we had discussed trying to limit the application of that energy conservation measure to the coldest climate zones. However, it was hotly debated, and I believe the committee opted for consistency. And so my understanding is that points will be made available for those warmer climate zones. However, I'm not sure if there will be additional points for even higher performing oil furnaces. I'm unclear on whether or not that was prioritized.
Yeah, I'll take another quick one. And sorry for keep putting you on the spot there, Alex.
Right.
Should there be allowances made for windows that face north or away from the maximum solar insolation?
Personal opinion, I believe so, and I expect comments will be submitted to that effect.
Maybe that's one that we can ask Brett. I'm going to go back here. So I think the net zero program is using a similar approach. Do you guys look at orientation? Could you comment on that?
No. So in our program, best practices builders in their training are looking at the orientation of the windows. But I can comment. Actually, this slide brings up a good point. Actually, that this performance path cooling criteria does look actually quite similar to the cooling criteria that we have in our net zero home labeling program. Not the same, But the idea that where space cooling is installed, that those homes don't need to meet the design cooling intensity, that's really similar. Our cooling intensity, or our space cooling load calculation, as we call it, is a different metric, but it's a very similar kind of cooling calculation criteria to prevent overheating in these highly efficient homes. So a similar idea.
And maybe before we move on, another plug, Brett, and I think was I involved in that last year's Tiered Energy Code webinar as well from June 2022. We did look into the peak cooling criterion quite a bit, and we pointed out that it's in the current code, the peak cooling criterion is potentially a bit erratic in what it disqualifies, because the peak cooling in the performance path is one of the three criteria for the performance path. It's the total target, your building envelope target, and you have to meet peak cooling, and that trips compliance in many areas. So I would encourage everyone to look at that for their current code that's being adopted right now, and potentially having a conversation of asking the province to consider including these proposed requirements once they're approved into their current code.
Absolutely.
And on that, Frank, are you ready to continue to move forward?
Move on. Thank you. So the next topic is greenhouse gas emissions, another significant change, another significant first in Canadian building and energy codes. It is proposed that the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings are being regulated in the Building Code Section 936 and in the National Energy Code for buildings. I'll give you a 30-second primer on the life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions. As you follow the graphic from the left to the right, you can see that the emissions associated with buildings start with the production of building materials. Then they continue with the emissions during the construction process, and then the operation of buildings, and finally end with the disposal or recycling, or ideally with the reuse of materials. The only portion of these emissions that are proposed to be addressed in the 2025 codes are those from the operation of buildings. For Section 936, this means the emissions that stem from heating or cooling buildings and from heating water. That's all. You see this portion of the carbon life cycle in the light green. They are also often referred to as step B6, B7, or operational emissions. The emissions that occur during the extraction or production of raw building materials are called embodied emissions, because they have already occurred when the building material arrives on site. And regulation of embodied emissions from building materials is expected for the 2030 codes. Excuse me. The changes that are in this public review are highlighted on the right. There are the provisions that introduce the objectives and the functional statements. It is worth noting here that CHPA participated in the policy consultation on the greenhouse gas emissions, and some HPAs as well, but that the policy direction from the board was not finalized before all the technical requirements were approved for public review by the committees. So here's what the new objective looks like, and the new functional statement. In short, it says that greenhouse gas emissions are unacceptable, and the greenhouse gas emissions the code addresses are those caused by excessive emissions of greenhouse gases, and the building fulfills the function of limiting operational greenhouse gases. I mean, it makes one point very, very clearly for sure, but it isn't as well expressed as some of the other objectives. We will be commenting on this, that is too broad, to the point where the objective, which is the goal of the requirement here, is identical with the function of the building that achieves that goal. And the third level objective simply repeats the broad goal of the second level objective. We also think that the phrase "as a result of design and construction of the building system" is already addressed by the building envelope energy and equipment efficiency. So that's energy. The emissions, however, are a function of the fuel selection and operation, or at least intended operation of building energy systems. And so we would like also a little bit of recognition in this text that the control of excessive emissions is not within the purview of building designers and builders, but in the quality and cleanliness of the energy that may come into the building through public infrastructure like electrical wires or gas lines. So what we are suggesting, therefore, is rewriting that objective a little bit into OE2 as an objective of this code is to limit the probability that as a result of the intended operation and the selection of high-intensity energy sources, greenhouse gas emissions will have an unacceptable effect on the environment. The risks of unacceptable effects on the environment due to greenhouse gas emissions addressed in this codes are those caused by selecting energy sources for space heating and cooling equipment and water heating equipment that have high intensity emissions. In both areas of the building code, or it's not in both, in other areas of the building code, a functional statement usually offers the actual function that the building is performing in support of an objective which is trying to reach. It does not simply repeat the negative outcome that the objective has already stated. So in other functional statements in the NBC, it would also use words like control, provide, facilitate, maintain, minimize. And since the technical requirements only address the energy source or the energy type of the building energy equipment, we think this should be reflected in the functional statements. We will suggest, therefore, describing the function a building performs to achieve OE2 as follows, or as like to control the type of energy sources used in space conditioning and water heating systems. So this is likely what we'll be commenting on. Objectives and functional statements are written in much softer language than the technical requirements. We recognize that, but getting them right will be important when alternative solutions are being proposed later on, and then they have to prove that they comply with the objectives and functional statements. But let's get into the proposed technical requirements. This is the performance path. These changes will go to the winter 2024 public review. If you've used an energy model for energy efficiency compliance, this is what you would do. You simply take, I say simply too often, so you take the total space conditioning and water heating energy demand loads from your energy model, you multiply it by the regional emission factor based on the proposed equipment fuel. Take a look at the emission factors at the bottom right of the screen. And then you compare that against the reference GHG emission factor. The percentage improvement of your home's emissions then determines the emission performance level. You see the levels at the top right. So for energy, we're talking about tiers. For GHG emissions, we're talking about levels. The levels A to F were chosen because they're consistent with other international codes and guides. And in the energy modeling, your reference house values change with the design of your proposed house. We just heard that example explaining oil furnace versus gas furnace. For GHG emissions, the reference emission factor values are static. That means the same reference value for everyone in the country. So if you did a short example calculation in your head, you would quickly see that that the same house with the same demand load would have a vastly different GHG emission depending on whether it's built in Alberta or in Manitoba. So pretty much everything in Manitoba, even a tier 1 home, will achieve a level A performance. In Alberta, even a tier 5 home might not do better than level C emission performance. This has obviously little or nothing to do with how the homes are built, and most, if not everything, to do with how clean the energy is that the home is using. But you can also see that in most locations, an electric heating or cooling equipment or water heating equipment will do better than gas. And now what you see in red here is also noteworthy. Even though the code apparently now addresses emissions from a building energy source, it is absolutely silent on zero emission energy sources like photovoltaics, for example. We think this really questions the whole net zero concept that the codes were aiming for, and we will be commenting accordingly. This is what's being proposed as prescriptive solution. CHB is hoping that this change can still make it to the public review and into the 2025 code in time. Originally, prescriptive requirements were ruled out of scope for this subject, but CHBA kept pointing out that without prescriptive solutions, many builders would not be able to show compliance because they don't have the input values from an energy model for each house. We actually think this prescriptive solution is simple and workable. It works through a series of lookup tables where you determine your emission performance level based on the space heating and water heating option in that home. I've copied and pasted portions of 2 tables here on the right. If you look at the excerpted table on the top right, which has the requirements for level B, so pretty good. You can see, for example, an all-electric home in Alberta would have to meet tier 5 to achieve level B, while the same home in Manitoba to be built to tier 2 because Manitoba's emission factor or greenhouse, or GEF, I think it's called, is much lower. When we look at the lower table excerpt, which is for level D, we can see that there are still some all gas solutions and some dual energy packages possible, but you can also see the effect of using an electric heat pump for heating and water heating in Alberta, which is the last row. You would only need a tier 1 energy efficiency package to reach level D, while you would need to build a tier 4 energy compliance in order to use an all gas solution, which is at the top row of the lower table. So this is not to say that the proposed change will not be significant and impactful, but just to point out that prescriptive compliance seems pretty straightforward. And again, no credits for renewables. As I said earlier, we think on the prescriptive side, it might be even easier to implement a credit for renewables, but by setting a minimum of installed capacity and bumping up the performance level based on additional installed capacity. We think in places like Alberta, this would make a huge, and I think there's others, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, make a huge difference, at least in the short to midterm, say the next 10 years. So in a somewhat simplified form, this is what it looks like across the country. This is a quick study that, and maybe I'll let Brett talk to that. He took a single home and took it across the country just to see what this might look like. Maybe Brett, if you're ready to speak to it.
Yeah, sure. This is just a single model from one home. It actually originally started as a home in Ontario that was using all that really matters is that it was using gas space heating and gas domestic hot water. So we found that it initially scored an emissions score of an F, and then we decided let's take a look at what it would look like if we changed the mechanical systems to be all electric. So baseboards and then an electric storage tank, and its score moved up to a C when we did that. And then we wanted to see what air source heat pump would do to that. So when we did that, it moved up to a B. And then we wanted to see what would it look like if we did a gas backup instead of an electric backup to that air source heat pump. And in that case, it dropped back down to a C. And then we decided, let's just change the provinces to see what the emission factors would be for all of the different provinces. So we extrapolated up and down with all the different provincial emission factors, and that's what you can see there. So interestingly, some of the provinces performed quite differently, and some of them, even with the higher emission factors, performed poorly with some electric sources. But for the most part, when you move to electricity, it seemed to be better off. But in that one case there, Nunavut, just to describe what those dashes mean, that's because the proposed house actually scored more poorly than the reference house. And that's because they have the very high emission factor for electricity. So it was lower than 0% actually. So that's why it was a dash. Pretty interesting results. This is just one single house. It wasn't net zero or anything, just one example extrapolated onto kind of all the or several different possibilities across all the provinces and territories.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it makes the point again that the control of this requirement does not lie in the hand of builders, but in the hand of the energy production industry, really, and in terms of the emission factors. And I think that was the last slide for this. We can turn to commentary and or questions.
Yeah, a lot of feedback. So just want to thank everyone for participating. Kind of a lot of questions from previous slides as well. I guess we'll jump into this one. I guess, is there any concerns with the new energy code gas emissions requirements going forward for affordable housing, low-cost housing?
I can maybe start that. I mean, yes, there's always concern because we know that this is the other crisis in the country, affordability and housing supply, and that ideally everything would be cost neutral. Really, how this will play out is that the code, as it did for the tiers in energy and now for the levels on GHG, provides a pathway to an ultimate goal. And we can debate whether it's tier 4 or tier 5. I mean, Brett suggested maybe something a little less than tier 5, but ultimately net zero energy was the target for energy. And near net zero is the target according to the policy guidance for GHG, and that will be level A. When, on where, and how the provinces will make that a requirement to get to a high tier and a high level is up to them. And I think that's what will answer the question on affordability. That's how I would answer it. Maybe Alexandre, do you have another view?
Definitely not an opposing view. I think affordability is a big issue. I guess the one thing I will say is that we are really trying hard to get costing data from builders, regional costing data from builders. And I just want to plug the CanMet Leap team who's doing workshops across the country trying to collect this data, which ideally could be used to inform these code changes. And so if you're attending some of those workshops, I encourage you to share your data. I believe that it's anonymized and whatnot. And so we're really between a rock and a hard place when it comes to getting costing data, because we know that it varies depending on the builder, even within a jurisdiction. And so
yeah, and one thing that, and maybe we'll talk about this later when other questions are coming in, one thing that becomes clear now is that in some cases it may be worth, if there is any cost, it may be worth considering, is the cost better spent in the envelope or on the GHG side? And none of that actually answers any of the operational costs, which means for the consumer. And so there's now three variables floating that need to be considered. So it doesn't necessarily become simple, but we're all keenly aware of that. And I think anyone of us who's going to these committees make these points all the time.
And just one other point. I mean, I mentioned or hinted at the fact that there was a task group working on developing packages for the other tiers. And so we talked about tier 5 being highly ambitious, ultra high performance. And so we had to pull out all of the stops to try and meet those performance targets. When we're talking about tier 2 and 3, there's a little bit more wiggle room. And so we're starting to look at different packages, different compliant packages, and trying to identify the cost optimal package. However, in absence of any legitimate costing data, it makes it very difficult. And so we're stuck trying to make decisions with the information that we have. And so again, I just encourage you to engage with that task group if you're at all able.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's great. Frank, do you have something to say?
No, that's good. I'm just more agreeing that costing is critical, and at least maybe in the proposed changes, we will make a comment to at least state what the costing base was from when that costing was. That will allow people to say, oh, it's a 2019 or 2020 cost data point, so I know what to do to get there. Or if it's a new one, 2023, here's what we did to come up with that. And we'll make a couple of points and a couple of changes like that when we comment on this.
Yeah, that's great. Frank, a question for you. Perhaps you can walk people through the emissions table, where it was in the absence of data from the P&T. Can you just expand on that, please?
Yes. So this is, I think the sentence, as you just said, in the absence of any, if your province and territory has data that they publish on these emission factors, you're supposed to use those. If they don't issue any, the National Building Code has these values in that section 936.12, I think it is at the point at the current time. And the code is also explaining how they arrived at these. Are not today's values, are not daily values. They are averaged over, I believe, a year, and they are future projected what we anticipate it to be. I believe, and Alexandre, if you can correct me, to 2030 to 2035. That's where those data come from. And if provinces want to publish their own, they can do so. And that's the one you're using. And if not, you use the ones that the National Building Code has. And it is anticipated, actually, that they might change over in every code cycle type thing. Like as we get to know how the grids are greening and how the numbers are changing, that will be reflected.
That's a great response. Thanks for clarifying, Frank. Alex, I have a question for you. Can you confirm which software was used to develop the packages?
Certainly. And so it was HOT 2000 version 11.8, I believe. And it was, we used the command line interface with HTAP, which is the Housing Technology Assessment Platform, which allows us to do hundreds of thousands of runs on hundreds of archetypes in all climate zones. And so the inner workings are really HOT 2000, but it's more under a research interface, I guess.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Frank, would you like to carry on, or do you have time for more questions?
I
Perhaps
think
we'll get the questions later on.
yes, let's go because I think you're right. We missed. Yeah, see, it's time. It's good. This is why we have those little time reminders there for us. Thanks, Alex. Actually, this is Alexandre. I'll just pass on the slides for you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll give you a nod when I'd like the slide changed over. So I just want to talk a little bit about PCF 2011, which is updating the heat pump water heater performance rating metric to reflect a new performance. Well, it's the same performance test standard, but it was updated in 2020. And now the output of that test procedure is a uniform energy factor rather than an energy factor. And so this kind of highlights the challenge in trying to maintain alignment between the different regulations that are in play when we talk about energy using equipment like furnaces and hot water heaters. And so we have the Canadian Energy Efficiency Regulations, or rather the Federal Energy Efficiency Regulations, but then there's also the National Building Code, which, as we know, is within the jurisdiction of the provinces and territories. And so there's a bit of regulatory overlap there, which makes it challenging to ensure consistency in how these products are defined, the title, and also what test standard these are subject to. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, the performance rating, or at least the metric that's used to characterize the performance to enable comparison between those two units. And so this proposed change is really to align with the performance testing standard CSA C745, updated in 2020. And so the intent here is really just to update the requirement to reflect the latest metric. It is not intended to make the requirement more stringent. And so that basically summarizes this proposed change, but it's really just kind of highlighting the fact that there are these different regulatory levers that are in play, and it's really important that we try to maintain consistency, not only in the language and vocabulary that's used to define these pieces of equipment, but also in the performance test standards that are mandated, so to speak. And so I can feel a question coming around a very similar proposed change with respect to single phase air conditioners and heat pumps. And so I can talk about that really quickly right now. And basically, we had submitted a proposed change to update the heat pump heating season performance factor to heating season performance factor 2, which is a new performance rating metric that comes out of the M1 test procedure that we've recently adopted as part of the energy efficiency regulations. And so again, this is a lot of information. What I'm trying to say is that these are evolving on different cycles. And so we anticipate new regulations to come online for, again, single phase air conditioners and heat pumps. Those are being brought online in 2025, but we're already aware of those requirements. And so we're trying to get ahead of the curve in introducing these metrics into the code, because if we don't get it in this code cycle, we may miss the boat, so to speak, in trying to bring alignment with respect to those metrics. And it's really critical for authorities having jurisdiction, because they show up on site, they want to ensure that the builder is meeting the requirements. They look at the nameplate of the equipment or the spec sheet or whatever. They want to see the metric that's used in the market. They don't want to see the metric that's irrelevant because it's outdated or whatnot. And so maybe we can move on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about heat pumps. And so we talked about heat pumps under the prescriptive path, which was an interesting exercise. And again, I just want to give a big shout out to Adam Wills, who did a lot of the heavy lifting on this work. And so it became evident to us that prescribing a heat pump was going to be challenging. If you're doing performance modeling, it's no big deal, because the model accounts for the outdoor temperature and the performance of the model, and the capacity of the system in comparison to the demand load that the house needs. And so all of that is taken into account if you're doing the performance compliance path. Under the prescriptive compliance path, it's not as easy as just saying throw in a heat pump, because there are these other variables in play. Is the heat pump meeting the full heating demand? That's obviously a big variable. The other obvious one is the performance of the heat pump, and so the output of the performance test. And then lastly, it's the operating condition. And so I've got these two slides here that basically illustrate that the efficiency of heat pumps tends to drop as the outdoor temperature gets lower. And so you'll notice, I guess the point of those two graphs is to show that heat pumps in climate zone 4 provide greater savings than heat pumps in climate zone 7B. And the reason for that is because it can operate for a longer period of time in climate zone 7A because it's not hitting that cutoff point. And so you'll notice on the x-axis, there is percentage of peak load. And so this was something that we came up with to try and characterize how much of the peak load was being taken on by the heat pump, by the air source heat pump. And so you'll notice it goes down from 40% to 100%. We had a really good discussion at the task group level around cases where it's appropriate to size the heat pump to meet 100% of the peak heating load. In the lower mainland of BC, for example, where they have relatively mild climate, it's totally logical. But in other parts of Canada, that would be silly. And so we've kind of landed on 60% being a reasonable starting point. And then, as you saw, I talked about that table under the points-based approach that allows you to plug and play, and we're going to get to that slide just now. There we go. And so at first sight, you might be wondering, what the heck do I have to do with this? And so you'll notice that each climate zone has a function, and that function is intended to represent the efficiency curve of heat pumps in that climate. And so you'll notice there's two variables there. The F variable is the rated capacity of your air source heat pump. And so this is tested at 8.3 degrees C. And it's divided by the design heating load of the home as determined by F280. And so this is how you determine how much of the load is being taken on by the heat pump. And so this is a simple division. And then the other factor is the HSPF2 region 5, a number that you could easily identify on the nameplate or on the spec sheet or something like that. And so the intent here is to provide maximum flexibility. If you do want to size your heat pump to meet 100% of the load, then you can use this table and claim maximum amount of points. If you're doing only 75%, also available for you. There was that other table where the portion of the heating load that was taken on by the air source heat pump was fixed at 60%. And so this one is inherently less flexible, but easier to implement because you can look up the value and immediately get how many points you would get for this measure. And so that was kind of a long-winded way of saying that it's pretty complicated to prescribe heat pumps, but we felt that it was a legitimate high-performance technology, and we certainly wanted to have points for that. Some of you may remember that the points-based approach was introduced in the last code cycle. However, there were very few eligible measures, and so this time around we tried to include more measures to make this a viable path, because we heard that the industry likes this, and so I like to think that it's really improved with what we're proposing.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and just a reminder, that was from the tiers point system. That's where those tables live for the heat pumps. That's what you get the points for. So for those who use heat pumps a lot and who are familiar with these, the F280 method as well, I would encourage them to look at that proposed change form when it comes out in 2024. I must say I was challenged by understanding all the details, and it's a very complicated matter. And for my taste, the code writing was also not very straightforward. So what I would encourage everyone to do is, once that PCF 2001 is out, have a look, and we'll do so as well, and make sure that it's clear and understandable and applicable to how people can use it. And with that, I believe we have all our 5 topics done. I could do a little bit about how to enter and write comments, or we could continue with questions, and then I'll take the last 3 minutes if that's, Alex, are the question continuing to pour in, or?
Definitely, yeah, it's a really great response, so this is awesome. Alex, I'll send a question your way. Does fixing the test parameter at 8 degrees Celsius incentivize poorer performance units being installed?
Good question. It's really complicated. And so we're looking at the capacity tested at 8 degrees C, understanding that that's not the environment in which the heat pump is going to be run. And so this was an input into the energy model. It was one of the data points that we could use to come up with this prescriptive solution. And again, it's a little bit confusing to explain that it's the capacity tested at 8 degrees C. It does not represent where that unit is being installed. The 8 degrees C, 8.3 degrees C just reflects the test procedure. And so all units are subject to that test, and it gives you an ability to compare how they perform at that test condition.
That's great. Yeah. Another question. Has thermal mass for ICF been considered for points? I guess let me paraphrase that. Can you use ICF and be attributed the points?
Certainly, you can be attributed the points as long as the measure meets the effective RSI. And so we haven't considered anything with respect to thermal mass. It's really just the effective thermal characteristic of the assembly.
Yeah, that's perfect. Another one here. Are there any rules regarding the conversion between using the cold climate heat pump and the furnace?
Conversion.
I guess would that be, removing the existing four-stirred furnace and installing a heat pump? I guess, does that make sense?
Read that question again then. Oh, maybe I can.
We may have lost it, but
Okay.
my apologies.
Alex, did you get that? So the conversion of points from heat pumps to, I guess the models. So I'm not sure if it's a modeling question. Then the answer would be it's the same model that analyzed both.
Perhaps it's an AEB question, Frank, an alteration to existing building. Does that seem appropriate?
Oh, you mean if you convert from a furnace to a heat pump? I wouldn't know what. Okay, so let me spring up one point actually that for additions. So for the if the alteration of an existing building is staying within the bounds of the current dimensions of the current building, the requirements of the tiered energy code would not apply. But if it's an addition, potentially the portion of the addition, the tiered point systems and the package systems may be applicable. And if in that addition there is then an equipment like a furnace, but then it wouldn't be a conversion, it would just be a new installation. So I'm not sure if it can relate to that, but that's what's behind that. So yeah, I would have liked to read the question again. Sorry.
No, that's on me. Brett, don't get too comfortable. There's a question coming your way. Somewhat of a comment. I have a concern that peak cooling requirements are not considered if air conditioning is included. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, we can. I think that's just a general comment we can probably chat about offline to dig more into about what that concern is. I can guess more about the concern, but I'd have to find out what the person is actually wanting to.
No, that's
provide.
definitely that's appropriate. Thank you, Brett. Do you have a
But
question
the
here,
energy,
Frank?
maybe just to confirm, the energy is being counted. So if the air conditioning is installed, it is part of the energy model. So if that's the concern, yes, it will mitigate overheating as a risk. And the energy for the air conditioning unit is also being considered in the model. So especially in a net zero home program, you would have to account for that energy if that's the concern that's being taken care of.
No, that's great, and Brett will certainly coordinate to expand on that. There is a comment or question here, Frank. Can you please touch on how effectively submitting comments on the PCFs? Sorry, I'm paraphrasing here.
Yep.
Basically, how can we write an effective comment on the PCFs? Can you please?
Perfect. So what I'll do is I'll
that?
take that as a cue to do the last 3 slides, and then we're actually almost out of time too. Obviously we've whetted everyone's appetite to submit some comments. So I'll tell you what CHBA is doing to submit our comments, and then I give a few tips on how to write good comments. And the QR code on this slide is actually to get you to the site where you can find the entrance point. The graphic in the back is the page that you see. You scroll all the way down and you find a link to the proposed change form. And on top of the proposed change forms is then the link to the comments. This is the process that we use to draft our comments. CHBA has communicated that the public review has started. National staff, Alex, Jack, myself have started reviewing the proposed changes and drafting the comments. And we hold webinars, obviously, as you see here. And we have, once we have the draft comments, we send them to our Technical Research Committee, Management Committee, and provincial HBAs and a couple of other committees to review the draft comments and to collect further feedback, whether there's anything missing and whether we're right on track or whether there's something else we need to comment on. And with that feedback from our home builders associations, the national staff will then finalize and submit comments. And we encourage provincial and local HBAs to individual members to submit reinforcing comments with province or location specific details, costing, as Alexandra mentioned, for example. Our aim here is to ensure that we are aligned at all three levels of the association on the comments we submit. And so here is that slide. This is a list of writing tips. And in the last couple of webinars, I've sort of said I'm not going to go through it. If you want to submit your comments, refer to it. But maybe I'll take this one because it's the last one to actually go through this. So really, it's clear writing guidelines. I would start by describing how the proposed change applies to your situation. Let's take heat pumps, for example. Yes, I install heat pumps a lot. I do the calculations, in this performance. And then describe what in the proposed change form works and what doesn't. Like, why do you have difficulties? Why it's not clear? Is there a solution that you're using that isn't reflected or that's difficult? And explain why you cannot support the change. That's important. Either you can't support it at all. There's 5 categories of do not support or support with modification, where you have to write something, or support with a comment, or support as is, or you just say no opinion. But when you propose your own modification, you suggest an alternative wording for that code sentence. And I think that's very important because that makes it clear to the committee what it is that's, and it may not be the final wording that's accepted, but it gives an idea to the committee what may be wrong. And that makes it a lot easier for the committee to deal with your comment and justify how your proposed modification or alternative solves the problem that you had. Support that with evidence. If it's costs, yes, even the costing data can be updated. If it's other evidence, as we just saw, the drain water heat recovery, yes, the system exists. It's not currently referenced. Put the manufacturer in the instructions and so that the committee can see that they need to widen the rules. Be concise and precise. So if your comment gets long, I have that problem a lot. Use one idea, one modification per paragraph and number them. That makes it very easy. Just to give you one example, the CHBA's comments on the lateral load provisions that we didn't talk about today, but the last episode was, I think we had 45 comments. And I think it took the task of 5 meetings to get through all of those. So and it makes it easy because we can just simply say, this is the comment number 1, comment number 2. It allows the NRC staff to parse our comments and treat it accordingly very effectively. So that is a quick comment writing guide, really. I believe we're at the end. I don't know, Alex, we have 1 minute. Is there one final question that we want to answer, or do we just wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, just one question because it is pertinent to the comments. So I guess when you do make a comment, will the comments be responded to? How do we know they have been reviewed?
Right, good point. Yes, the committees have a requirement to look at every comment and to respond and dispose of every comment. So the only common categories that they don't look at is if you say support as is or no opinion. Those get reported in bulk. You see a page, there's 10 people coming in and they've all support. You will see them as a bulk. If there's a comment, the support with comment, for example, the committee will see the comment, but the committee doesn't have to respond to say, oh, we need to do something about that comment. So comments could be, hey, it's great. We've been waiting for this. However, See, however, if you have any modification to what goes out in the code, you need to say support with modifications, and the committee then has to say whether it acts on the modification and writes it, or agrees with your revisions and writes something different, or whether it says we've talked about this, there's a reason why we didn't do it. So they have to make a call. They have what's called a possible committee action that they discuss, and then a final committee action on every comment with modification, for sure.
That's great, Frank. Yeah, I mean, your passion on the topic is contagious, I would say. One last question, I believe, and then we could wrap it up. But when will the draft CHBA comments be ready? Will CHBA be supporting all of these changes, or will they represent their builder membership?
So I could ask you to answer that. So we as of this morning, we have a set of final draft comments. We will send them out to the TRC Management Committee, and I think they're meeting on Monday. And then the HBAs and the people that we send it to can distribute it further. So if our email addresses are here, if there's specific PCFs that anyone would like to know what we're commenting on, we can share that at this point. We have our draft committee draft comments on the proposed changes. And we may also meet. I had a meeting with the fenestration industry. We may meet again and make sure that we understand the subject. Or I may meet with Alexandre again and say, explain that heat pump thing again to me. So, this was very helpful, by the way, and maybe I'll use that as a wrap. So between now and December 18th, there will be a lot of discussions to make sure that we really make sure that the code requirements that go into public review that they can work, and that we find modifications that are workable and simply understood and clear. Maybe I'll give Brett and Alexander one last 30 seconds for last comments. I'll start with you, Alexander.
No, thank you very much for having me. If anybody's got questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is not on there, but I'm sure the fine folks at CHBA will pass it along.
Yes, my apologies. This was a quick last minute. I didn't update the slide to put Brett's or Alexander's email on there. This is our tech team here. So please contact one of us and we'll link you. Thank you, Alexander and Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Thanks for including me. Happy to be involved and share some perspectives from the voluntary side. So appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'd like to, of course, thank you as well for joining us today, and on short notice and on a little bit of a soft and loose end. But it's great. The insights you shared today were really, really good. They helped me, I can tell you that. After that, all that's left for me is to remind you that we will post the slide deck and the recording, hopefully early next week, maybe because we're on Thursday, even tomorrow. We encourage you to review the code changes that affect you, and work with your local HBA to submit comments or contact one of us here. And because it's the last one, and who knows whether we're going to see you again, I'll wish you also a peaceful and quiet holiday season and a happy new year. And stay tuned for more webinars in February and March next year. Thank you. Goodbye.